The morning mist clung to Lake Erie like a shroud, but 27-year-old Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry could feel destiny stirring beneath the gray waters. Standing on the deck of his flagship Lawrence, named for the fallen Captain James Lawrence, whose dying words, "Don't give up the ship," had become his battle cry, Perry gazed across the lake where the British squadron waited like silent sentinels. The young Commodore's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his telescope, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility pressing upon his shoulders. The entire War of 1812 on the Great Lakes hinged on this moment. Behind him lay the American settlements, vulnerable and waiting. Before him stretched the contested waters that had become the key to controlling the northwestern frontier. Perry had arrived at Presque Isle in March, taking command of a ragtag collection of hastily built vessels and green sailors. The fleet that now sailed under his command consisted of 9 ships, most constructed from the virgin forests of Pennsylvania. His flagship Lawrence carried 20 guns, while her sister ship Niagara, under the command of Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott, boasted 20 guns of her own. The smaller vessels, the Ariel, Caledonia, Porcupine, and others completed his squadron. The British squadron, commanded by Commander Robert Harriet Barclay, consisted of 6 warships led by the formidable HMS Detroit. Barclay, a seasoned naval officer who had lost an arm fighting under Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar, commanded a force that on paper seemed superior in experience and training. His ships carried 63 guns total, slightly fewer than Perry's 64. But his crews were battle-hardened veterans of the Royal Navy. As dawn broke on September 10, 1813, Perry had made his decision. The British had been waiting near Put-in Bay, and Perry knew that every day of delay strengthened their position while weakening his own. General William Henry Harrison's army remained trapped in Ohio, unable to advance into Canada without naval support. The fate of the entire Northwestern campaign rested on the outcome of this day's battle. The Commodore called his officers to quarters aboard the Lawrence. The ship's deck creaked under their feet as they gathered around their young commander. Perry's voice carried clearly across the still morning air as he addressed his men. "Gentlemen, we have been preparing for this moment since our arrival. Today we carry not just the hopes of our nation, but the spirit of every sailor who has given his life for American independence." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the guns and clearing the decks for action. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the fresh lake air as the cannons were loaded and the battle flags hoisted. Perry had chosen his personal banner carefully, a blue flag bearing the words, "Don't give up the ship," in bold white letters, honoring Captain Lawrence's final command. As the American squadron formed its line of battle, Perry could see the British ships in the distance, their red ensigns fluttering in the morning breeze. Commander Barclay had positioned his squadron to take advantage of the wind, hoping to use his superior gunnery experience to devastating effect. The Detroit led the British line, followed by the Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, and the smaller vessels that made up Barclay's force. The distance between the two fleets began to close as Perry gave the order to advance. The Lawrence led the American line, followed by the Caledonia, Niagara, and the remaining vessels. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the full scope of the approaching battle. On both sides, sailors prepared for what they knew would be a fight to determine the control of Lake Erie, and, with it, the fate of the war in the Northwest. Perry took one last look at his fleet, then at the approaching enemy. History would remember this day, he thought, as either the moment American naval power was established on the Great Lakes or the day it died in the attempt. At 11:45 in the morning, the silence of Lake Erie shattered like glass. The first shot came from the British Detroit, a ranging shot that sent a towering waterspout skyward just ahead of the Lawrence. Perry felt the deck vibrate beneath his feet as his gun crews responded, the 20 cannons of his flagship roaring their defiance across the water. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most ferocious naval engagements of the War of 1812. The Lawrence, leading the American line, bore the brunt of the British fire as she closed with the enemy. Perry had ordered his squadron to engage at close quarters, knowing that his lighter-built vessels and inexperienced crews would fare better in a savage, short-range battle than in a long-distance artillery duel. Commander Barclay's tactical plan became clear as the engagement developed. The British commander had positioned his most powerful ships, the Detroit and Queen Charlotte, to concentrate their fire on Perry's flagship while keeping the dangerous Niagara at a distance. The Queen Charlotte, originally intended to engage the Niagara, instead joined the Detroit, impounding the Lawrence with devastating effect. According to historical accounts from the U.S. Naval Institute, Perry's flagship became the center of a maelstrom of iron and fire. The Lawrence's deck ran red with blood as British shot tore through her rigging and hull. Perry, conspicuous in his blue uniform, moved among his men with calm determination, encouraging them to maintain their fire even as their ship was being torn apart around them. Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott's Niagara remained frustratingly out of effective range during the early phases of the battle, either due to poor positioning or, as some would later claim, reluctance to close with the enemy. This left the Lawrence to face the concentrated fire of multiple British vessels, a punishment that no ship could long endure. The smaller American vessels, led by the schooner Ariel and the sloop Trip, pressed forward with remarkable courage despite their disadvantage in size and armament. The Caledonia, under Lieutenant Daniel Turner, engaged the British ships with determination, her guns adding their voice to the growing thunder of battle. As the engagement reached its crescendo, the Lawrence had become a floating wreck. Her masts hung in splinters, her hull was pierced by countless shot holes, and her deck was littered with the dead and dying. Of her crew of 103 men, 83 had been killed or wounded. The ship's wheel had been shot away, forcing sailors to steer by manipulating the rudder tackle directly. Perry himself had been grazed by British shot but remained on his feet, moving among his decimated crew with words of encouragement. When his cabin boy, a 13-year-old named Hannibal Collins, was struck down beside him, Perry felt the full weight of command's burden. Every man who fell was his responsibility. Every drop of blood spilled was on his conscience. The British were not escaping unscathed. The Detroit had suffered severe damage from the Lawrence's guns, and Commander Barclay had been severely wounded early in the action. The Queen Charlotte had also taken heavy punishment, her rigging shot away and her crew suffering mounting casualties. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the Lawrence could not continue the fight much longer. Her guns were falling, silent one by one as their crews were cut down or their carriages destroyed. Perry faced the most crucial decision of his career: surrender his flagship and likely lose the battle, or attempt something that had never been done in naval warfare. Looking across the water at the relatively undamaged Niagara, Perry made his choice. He would transfer his command to Elliott's ship and continue the fight. It was a desperate gamble that would require him to cross several hundred yards of open water under enemy fire, but it was the only chance to salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. The Commodore gathered his battle flag and his few remaining officers. The small boat that would carry them to the Niagara waited alongside the Lawrence, its crew ready to row through the storm of shot and shell that filled the air between the two American ships. The small boat rose and fell with the swells of Lake Erie as Perry and his handful of officers pulled away from the shattered Lawrence. Behind them, the flagship continued to fire her few remaining guns, her skeleton crew maintaining the pretense of battle to cover their Commodore's desperate dash to the Niagara. The British, seeing the small boat making its way across the water, concentrated their fire on this obvious high-value target. Water erupted around the boat as British shot searched for the American commander. Perry sat calmly in the stern, his blue battle flag clutched in his hands, refusing to duck as iron balls whistled overhead. His brother Alexander, serving as a midshipman, rowed with steady strokes despite the chaos surrounding them. The young Commodore knew that showing fear now would break the morale of every American sailor who could see him dot the journey across. The contested waters took 15 minutes that felt like hours. British marksmen in the rigging of the Detroit and Queen Charlotte took careful aim at the boat, but the rolling motion of their damaged ships spoiled their accuracy. One shot passed so close to Perry that it lifted his cap from his head. But still he maintained his composure, knowing that hundreds of eyes were watching his every move. Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott watched from the deck of the Niagara as his Commodore approached. The relationship between the two officers had been strained by Elliott's failure to bring his ship into close action. But as Perry climbed aboard the Niagara, Elliott saluted smartly and prepared to transfer to one of the smaller vessels to continue the fight. Perry's arrival on the Niagara transformed the battle. The ship had suffered relatively little damage during the first phase of the engagement, and her crew was fresh and ready for action. Perry immediately ordered the Niagara to close with the British line, determined to use his undamaged flagship to break the enemy formation. The British squadron, having concentrated on destroying the Lawrence, now found themselves facing a new threat. The Detroit and Queen Charlotte had used much of their ammunition and suffered significant casualties. Commander Barclay, severely wounded and barely conscious, could no longer effectively command his squadron. The initiative in the battle was shifting to the Americans. Perry ordered the Niagara to sail directly through the British line, a maneuver that would bring his ship within point-blank range of enemy guns, but would also allow him to fire into both sides of the British formation. It was a tactic that required perfect timing and iron nerve, but Perry had already proven he possessed both qualities in abundance. As the Niagara approached the British line, her guns loaded with grape shot and round shot, the crew could see the damage their Commodore's previous ship had inflicted on the enemy. The Detroit's mizzen mast hung at a drunken angle, her hull punctured by dozens of shot holes. The Queen Charlotte showed similar damage, her crew struggling to keep her afloat. The moment of truth arrived as the Niagara crossed the British line. Perry gave the order to fire, and 20 cannons roared simultaneously, sending a devastating broadside into the British ships. The range was so close that the muzzle flashes singed the enemy's rigging, and the effect was catastrophic. The Detroit, already weakened by her duel with the Lawrence, could not withstand this fresh assault. Her remaining masts toppled into the lake, and her gun crews were swept away by the storm of American shot. The Queen Charlotte fared no better, her stern galleries blown away and her decks cleared of men, but the Niagara had not escaped unscathed. British return fire had torn through her rigging and hull, and casualties mounted as Perry pressed his attack. The Commodore himself was struck by flying splinters but refused to leave the deck, knowing that his presence was essential to maintaining his crew's morale. The smaller American vessels, seeing their Commodore's bold maneuver, pressed forward to support the Niagara's attack. The Caledonia, Ariel, and others closed with the British line, their lighter guns adding to the devastating fire that was tearing the British squadron apart. Commander Barclay, barely conscious from his wounds, watched helplessly as his carefully planned battle dissolved into chaos. The British line was broken, his ships were taking water, and his casualties were mounting by the minute. The Royal Navy had not surrendered a squadron in living memory, but the situation on Lake Erie was becoming desperate. Perry, standing on the Niagara's quarterdeck with his battle flag flying proudly above him, could sense that victory was within his grasp. But the cost of that victory was becoming apparent as he looked back at the Lawrence, now barely afloat and silent except for the groans of her wounded crew. The smoke of battle drifted across Lake Erie like a funeral shroud as the British resistance began to crumble. Commander Barclay, bleeding from multiple wounds and barely able to stand, faced the most difficult decision of his naval career. The Detroit lay dead in the water, her guns silent and her crew decimated. The Queen Charlotte, commanded by Captain Robert Finnis until he was killed by American grapeshot, drifted helplessly with her steering shot away. Perry watched from the Niagara as the British ships, one by one, began to strike their colors. The Lady Prevost was the first to surrender, her hull so riddled with shot that she was in danger of sinking. The smaller British vessels followed suit, their crews overwhelmed by the concentrated fire of the American squadron. The Detroit held out longest, her crew fighting with the desperate courage of the Royal Navy, but with Barclay unconscious from loss of blood and most of her officers dead or wounded, resistance became futile. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, nearly 4 hours after the first shot was fired, the British ensign came down from the Detroit's MINMA. St. Perry felt no elation at the moment of victory. Looking across the water at the Lawrence, now barely afloat with her decks red with American blood, he understood the true cost of command. 83 of his sailors lay dead or wounded aboard his former flagship, their sacrifice the price of American control over Lake Erie. The Commodore's first action after securing the British surrender was to return to the Lawrence to check on his wounded crew. The sight that greeted him was one that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The ship's deck was littered with debris and bodies, her once proud guns dismounted and silent. In the ship's cockpit, the surgeon worked frantically to save the wounded, his apron soaked with blood. Among the British casualties was Commander Barclay himself, who had been struck by grapeshot and splinters throughout the battle. Despite being enemies, Perry ordered his own surgeon to attend to the British commander, recognizing the courage Barclay had shown in fighting against overwhelming odds. This gesture of professional courtesy between naval officers would be remembered long after the battle itself. The butcher's bill for the Battle of Lake Erie was sobering. The Americans had lost 27 killed and 96 wounded out of their total force of 532 men. The British suffered 41 killed and 94 wounded from their crew of 440. But beyond the numbers lay the human cost: young men who would never see their families again, officers who had given their lives for their respective flags. Perry took time to write letters to the families of his fallen officers, a duty he considered sacred. To the widow of Lieutenant John Brooks, killed aboard the Lawrence, he wrote of her husband's courage in the face of enemy fire. To the parents of Midshipman Henry Lobb, he described the young man's devotion to duty even as the ship was being shot to pieces around him. The strategic implications of the victory were immediately apparent. With the British squadron destroyed, the Royal Navy no longer controlled Lake Erie. This meant that British supply lines to Fort Detroit and other western posts were severed, forcing them to rely on the difficult overland route through Canada. General William Henry Harrison could now transport his army across the lake to attack the retreating British forces. As evening fell over the lake, Perry sat in his cabin aboard the Niagara and composed the message that would make him famous throughout the United States. Using a scrap of paper and writing on the back of an old letter, he penned the words that would echo through American history. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." The message was addressed to General Harrison, waiting anxiously at Put-in-Bay for news of the battle. Perry knew that his victory would enable Harrison to launch his long-planned invasion of Canada, but he also knew that the cost of that victory would be measured in the blood of American sailors. The British prisoners were treated with the respect due to brave enemies. Perry ordered that the wounded British officers be given the same medical care as his own men, and that the British dead be buried with full military honors. Commander Barclay, when he recovered consciousness, expressed his gratitude for the humane treatment his men had received. As the American squadron sailed toward Put-in-Bay with their prizes in tow, Perry reflected on the lessons of the day. Victory in naval warfare came not just from superior ships or tactics, but from the courage of individual sailors facing death in the service of their country. The Battle of Lake Erie had proven that American naval officers and seamen could match the best the Royal Navy could offer. Part 5. The Aftermath of Thunder. News of Perry's victory spread across the United States like wildfire, bringing hope to a nation that had endured too many defeats in the War of 1812. In Washington, President James Madison received the dispatch with enormous relief, knowing that control of Lake Erie would transform the strategic situation on the northwestern frontier. The victory proved that American naval forces could defeat the mighty Royal Navy in fleet action, a feat that had seemed impossible just years before. General William Henry Harrison wasted no time in exploiting Perry's victory. Within days of the battle, American troops began crossing Lake Erie aboard the captured British vessels and the surviving American ships. The sight of American soldiers landing on Canadian soil, supported by the guns of Perry's squadron, marked the beginning of the end for British power in the Northwest Territory. The British response to the disaster on Lake Erie was swift and severe. The loss of the squadron left Fort Detroit and other western posts virtually defenseless, their supply lines cut and their communication with the east severed. General Henry Proctor, commanding British forces in the region, had no choice but to begin a retreat up the Thames River, abandoning the Native American allies who had fought alongside the British throughout the war. Perry's victory had profound implications for the indigenous peoples of the Northwest Territory. The great Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who had allied with the British in hopes of creating a permanent Indian confederation, saw his dreams crumble with the British naval defeat. The loss of Lake Erie meant that British promises of support for Native American land rights became worthless, as the British could no longer project power into the region. The Commodore himself struggled with the aftermath of victory. The ghosts of his fallen sailors haunted his dreams, and he found himself questioning whether the strategic gains were worth the human cost. In letters to his wife Elizabeth, Perry wrote of his desire to leave the Navy and return to civilian life, tired of the burden of command and the responsibility for other men's lives. Public reaction to the victory was overwhelmingly positive, with newspapers across the country hailing Perry as a national hero. The phrase, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," became a rallying cry for American forces everywhere, symbolizing the growing confidence of the young nation in its ability to stand against European powers. Congressional medals were struck in Perry's honor, and his portrait appeared in homes throughout the United States. The treatment of prisoners from the battle became a model for humane conduct in warfare. Perry's decision to provide medical care for wounded British officers and to bury enemy dead with military honors earned praise from both American and British sources. Commander Barclay, upon his recovery, wrote to British authorities praising the courteous treatment he and his men had received from their captors. Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott's conduct during the battle became a source of controversy that would divide the Navy for decades. Critics argued that Elliott had held back the Niagara during the crucial early phase of the battle, forcing Perry to endure the concentrated fire of the British squadron alone. Elliott's defenders claimed that he had followed proper naval tactics, and that Perry's criticism was unjust. The dispute led to courts of inquiry and damaged reputations on both sides. The strategic consequences of the battle unfolded rapidly. Harrison's army, transported across Lake Erie by Perry's ships, caught up with the retreating British forces at the Battle of the Thames on October 5, 1813. In that engagement, Tecumseh was killed and British resistance in the Northwest Territory effectively ended. The chain of events that began with Perry's victory on Lake Erie had broken British power in the region permanently. For the Royal Navy, the defeat on Lake Erie was a shocking reminder that British maritime supremacy was not absolute. The loss of an entire squadron to a hastily assembled American fleet challenged assumptions about British naval invincibility that had been taken for granted since Trafalgar. Admiralty investigations into the defeat led to changes in naval tactics and a grudging respect for American naval capabilities. Perry's personal triumph was tinged with melancholy as he reflected on the cost of victory. The young Commodore had achieved everything a naval officer could hope for: decisive victory over a determined enemy, national recognition, and the gratitude of his country. Yet the memory of his fallen sailors, particularly those who had died aboard the Lawrence, cast a shadow over his achievement that would never fully lift. The Battle of Lake Erie had proven that American determination could overcome British experience, that hastily built ships crewed by volunteers could defeat the veterans of Trafalgar. But it had also demonstrated that victory in war always comes at a price measured in blood and sorrow, a lesson that Perry would carry with him for the rest of his life. The victory on Lake Erie sent shockwaves through the halls of power in London, where the Admiralty struggled to comprehend how a provincial American fleet had destroyed a Royal Navy squadron. First Lord of the Admiralty Viscount Melville ordered a thorough investigation into the defeat, seeking to understand how British naval supremacy had been challenged so effectively. The report that emerged painted a picture of American resourcefulness, overcoming British overconfidence, a lesson that would reshape Royal Navy thinking for decades. In the drawing rooms of Washington, Perry's triumph provided President Madison with the political capital he desperately needed. The War of 1812 had been deeply unpopular in New England, where merchants and politicians had opposed what they saw as an unnecessary conflict. The victory on Lake Erie, however, proved that American arms could prevail against the world's greatest naval power, transforming public opinion and strengthening Madison's political position. The economic implications of controlling Lake Erie became apparent within weeks of the battle. American merchants who had been cut off from Western markets by British naval dominance now found themselves able to trade freely across the Great Lakes. Goods that had been accumulating in warehouses from Buffalo to Detroit suddenly found their way to market, and the prices of commodities in the Ohio River Valley began to stabilize for the first time since the war began. Perry's leadership during the battle became a case study at naval academies around the world. His decision to transfer his flag from the damaged Lawrence to the intact Niagara was analyzed and debated by naval theorists for generations. The maneuver demonstrated that successful command required not just tactical skill, but also the moral courage to take enormous personal risks when the situation demanded it. The human cost of the victory weighed heavily on the survivors. Sailors who had served aboard the Lawrence carried physical and emotional scars that would last their lifetimes. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, waking at night to the sound of British cannon fire that existed only in their memories. Perry himself established a fund to support the widows and orphans of his fallen sailors, contributing from his own prize money to ensure their welfare. The treatment of Native American allies following the battle marked a tragic chapter in American expansion. With British power broken on Lake Erie, the indigenous peoples who had fought alongside the Crown found themselves abandoned and defenseless. Tecumseh's death at the Battle of the Thames effectively ended organized Native American resistance in the Northwest Territory, clearing the way for American settlement of lands that had been indigenous for countless generations. International reaction to the battle varied significantly. French naval officers, still smarting from their defeats at Trafalgar and other engagements, took quiet satisfaction in seeing the Royal Navy humbled by their former American colonies. Spanish and Portuguese naval authorities studied the battle closely, seeking lessons that might help them challenge British dominance in their own waters. The shipbuilding industry on the Great Lakes experienced a boom following Perry's victory. The success of vessels like the Lawrence and Niagara, built quickly from local materials by civilian shipwrights, proved that effective warships could be constructed far from traditional naval yards. This lesson would prove invaluable as America expanded westward and needed to project naval power on inland waters. Perry's famous dispatch, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," became more than just a military report. it became a statement of American national character. The phrase embodied the confidence and determination that would drive American expansion across the continent, but it also reflected a pragmatic approach to warfare that focused on results rather than glory. The battle's influence on naval architecture was profound and lasting. The effectiveness of American ships built for specific conditions on the Great Lakes challenged European assumptions about warship design. Naval architects began to consider how vessels could be optimized for particular theaters of operation rather than built to universal specifications. Religious communities across America interpreted Perry's victory as divine providence, seeing in the triumph proof that God favored the American cause. Sermons preached in churches from New England to the frontier praised the victory as evidence of American righteousness, contributing to a sense of national destiny that would shape American expansion for the next century. The legacy of the Battle of Lake Erie extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. It demonstrated that a young nation could challenge established powers through innovation, determination, and sacrifice. Perry's victory proved that American values courage, resourcefulness, and devotion to liberty could triumph over European traditions of military hierarchy and rigid tactical doctrine. For the sailors who survived the battle, the memory of that September day would remain vivid throughout their lives. They had witnessed history in the making, had seen their young nation come of age on the waters of Lake Erie. Their sacrifice and courage had purchased not just a tactical victory, but a strategic transformation that would echo through the generations. 20-5 years after the Battle of Lake Erie, an aging Oliver Hazard Perry stood before a gathering of naval officers at the newly established United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The hero of Lake Erie, now bearing the scars of a lifetime of service, looked out at the eager faces of young midshipmen who had grown up hearing tales of his legendary victory. His words that day would be remembered long after his death, encapsulating the lessons learned in blood and sacrifice on that September morning in 1813. "Gentlemen," Perry began, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience, "victory in naval warfare is not achieved by superior numbers or better ships alone. It is won by the courage to close with the enemy when others would stand off, by the wisdom to seize opportunity when it presents itself, and by the willingness to sacrifice everything for the success of the mission." The Battle of Lake Erie had indeed changed the course of American history in ways that became clearer with each passing year. The victory had not only secured control of the Great Lakes, but had also established American naval credibility on the world stage. European powers that had dismissed the United States Navy as a collection of privateers and coastal raiders were forced to acknowledge that American officers and sailors could stand toe-to-toe with the finest naval forces in the world. The strategic consequences of Perry's victory continued to unfold throughout the 19th century. Control of Lake Erie enabled American expansion into the Northwest Territory on an unprecedented scale. Cities like Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago grew from frontier outposts into major commercial centers, their prosperity built on the foundation of naval supremacy that Perry had established. The Great Lakes became an American sea, facilitating trade and communication across the continent's heartland. The human stories emerging from the battle took on mythic proportions as survivors aged and shared their memories. Sailors who had served aboard the Lawrence spoke of Perry's calm demeanor as British shot tore through the ship's rigging, of his refusal to seek shelter even as his officers fell around him. These accounts, passed down through families and naval traditions, helped establish the code of honor that would guide American naval officers through future conflicts. The controversy surrounding Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott's conduct during the battle persisted throughout both officers' careers and beyond. Naval historians continued to debate whether Elliott had shown proper caution or inexcusable timidity in the early phases of the engagement. The dispute highlighted the challenges of command in battle, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between glory and disgrace. Perry's treatment of British prisoners, particularly the wounded Commander Barclay, became a model for professional conduct in warfare that influenced American military culture for generations. The principle that brave enemies deserved respect and humane treatment, even in the heat of battle, became a cornerstone of American military ethics. This tradition would be tested in future conflicts, but would generally endure as a defining characteristic of American armed forces. The technical innovations demonstrated in the battle had lasting effects on naval warfare. The success of ships, built specifically for Great Lakes conditions, challenged traditional assumptions about warship design and construction. Naval architects began to consider how vessels could be optimized for specific theaters of operation, leading to advances in ship design that would prove crucial in later conflicts. The Battle of Lake Erie also marked a turning point in American-British relations. While the War of 1812 would continue for another year, Perry's victory demonstrated that the United States could not be dismissed as a minor power. The defeat of a Royal Navy squadron by American forces commanded respect in London and contributed to the eventual peace negotiations that would end the war on terms favorable to the United States for the Native American peoples of the Northwest Territory. The battle's aftermath brought tragedy and displacement. The collapse of British power following Perry's victory left indigenous communities defenseless against American expansion. The promises of land and sovereignty that had drawn many tribes to alliance with Britain became worthless once British naval power was broken on Lake Erie. As Perry himself aged, he reflected often on the cost of his victory. In his private correspondence, he wrote movingly of the sailors who had died under his command, of the responsibility he felt for their sacrifice, and of his hope that their deaths had served a purpose greater than mere military advantage. These reflections revealed a depth of character that explained why men had been willing to follow him into the storm of battle on Lake Erie. The Commodore's death in 1819, ironically from yellow fever contracted while fighting pirates in the Caribbean, brought an outpouring of national grief. His funeral in Newport, Rhode Island, drew naval officers, government officials, and ordinary citizens who recognized that they were mourning not just a war hero, but a man who had embodied the best qualities of American leadership. The Battle of Lake Erie entered American folklore as more than just a military victory. It became a symbol of the courage and determination that had built the nation. Perry's famous words, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," resonated through the generations as an expression of American confidence and capability. The battle proved that a young republic could stand against the established powers of the world and prevail through superior courage and skill. In the end, the Battle of Lake Erie represented everything that Americans wanted to believe about themselves and their nation. It was a victory won by citizen soldiers over professional military forces, by innovation over tradition, by determination over experience. The legacy of that September day in 1813 continued to inspire American naval officers and sailors through the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and beyond, a testament to the enduring power of courage and leadership in the face of overwhelming odds.